Hello, everyone. My name's Kara. So I'm going to do a brief, very broad strokes overview of sort of the measures of novel technologies in the ABCD study. So ABCD just broadly is the largest long-term study of brain development and child health in the US. It's based on school-based recruitment. At baseline, the goal was to recruit 11,500 9 to 10-year-olds and follow them longitudinally over the course of 10 years. So recruitment began in 2016. You can see sort of the study visit plan. So baseline, again, 2016 with a goal end date of 2027. And so now we're entering sort of 6 to 7 year follow-up. So the 9 and 10-year-olds that were recruited long time ago are entering sort of middle to late adolescence. So here's just a schematic of the timeline of events. So there are assessments approximately every 6 months in ABCD. Those are the least sort of involved assessments, and then there are annual assessments and biannual, so every other year. And so the biannual or the every other year assessments also include neuroimaging in addition to sort of biospecimens, neurocognitive batteries for both like iPad assessments and sort of what we think of as traditional pen and pencil assessments. And I do want to also say that the parents are also actively involved. It's not just the youth. So the parents are also filling out questionnaires. So this is a map of all the sites where data collection is occurring across the US. And so the goal was really to sort of reflect the diversity of the sort of youth population in the US. You'll see 2 little flags in addition to a pin in San Diego. That's because the coordinating center as well as the DAIRC, so the Data Analysis, Informatics, and Resource Center is also located at UCSD in addition to data collection site. So there are a number of work groups. So substance use, neurocognition, mental health, physical health, culture and environment, biospecimens, GISH, gender identity and sexual health, JEDI, biostats, genetics, and linked external data, in addition to novel technologies. And so this really allows us to link sort of mobile and digital technology use among youth to developmental health outcomes, but also to their cultures and environmental risk factors. And so here you can also see, this is just a flyer of the 5-year follow-up. You can see how the work groups or the assessment groups sort of link up to the measures. So this is the youth protocol. There's also a parent protocol. So for the parent protocol at 5 years, there are also physical health, mental health, culture and environment, substance use and mobile technology assessments for the parents as well. Oh, sorry, something happened to this slide where no one can read it. So apologies for that. So this just talks a little bit about the rationale for including novel technologies in a study of youth development, right? So one reason, right, is that we know that real-time behaviors affect outcomes for youth, right? Especially when we think about health outcomes. And it's really important to look at sort of within-person longitudinal behaviors in real life. And so novel technologies give us that ability to measure things like physical activity and sleep, which we do in ABCD via the Fitbit. So we get real-time physical activity and sleep data. We're also more recently initiated an app, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about, which allows us to get real-time sort of smartphone engagement behaviors from adolescents. And so moving forward, also using the smartphone can allow us to measure like geolocation, for example. So we can see how kids move through time and space and how their movement through time and space can affect their behaviors and their health outcomes, right? So for example, we know that neighborhood factors really can influence substance use for a number of youth. So that's something that could be down the line as well. Sorry, I think when I transferred this from my laptop, the font got messed up. And some of the slides didn't come across, so sorry. Okay, so EARS is the Effortless Assessment of Risk States. It's a passive sensing app that was implemented in ABCD. So it's downloaded from the Google Play or the App Store. It runs sort of consistently in the background of the use's phone. It scrapes the operating system every 3 minutes. It measures screen on, screen off. It measures all the foreground applications, and it takes note of the date and time of use and duration of use. So it's really not meant for participant interaction, right? It's a passive app. So if the kids try to interact with it, they get a message that's essentially just like, thank you for contributing to our knowledge of health. If there is a cessation of data collection for any period of time, the app will automatically push a notification to the youth to sort of trigger their active participation in getting the app running again. If there's a prolonged cessation of data collection, the RAs can reach out and sort of trigger the participants to sort of open the app and get it collecting data again. Okay. Now we're back to regular font size. Okay, in terms of privacy, data is encrypted before upload to a secure cloud server. No identifiable information is collected, and most importantly, no identifiable information is collected about people with whom the youth is interacting, right? So friends, family, whoever they're speaking with or engaging with on their smartphones, none of their data is collected either. Okay, back to small. Okay, so in terms of pre-processing, so composite categories are created for the types of apps that kids engage with. So I'm gonna look because I don't know them all by heart. So like communication, gaming, music, news, reading, social media, and streaming. And then there are two sort of standalone categories, including text messaging. And so you actually can't see, but if you could see, that they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, right? So like Facebook, for example, can fall into communication as well as social media. Okay, so related to the EARS app, there are also youth questionnaires as well as parent questionnaires. There are pre-assessment and post-assessment. So the pre-assessment, in addition to getting sort of objective data from the app, we're getting subjective data about how much time the youth believe that they're spending on their smartphone, any parental monitoring around their smartphone use, and if they feel like they're on their smartphone, how much they feel like they're on their smartphone in comparison to other youth their age. And then we get the post-assessment data, similar to the pre-assessment data, as well as how they think their behaviors may have changed while they were using the EARS app. And then there are parent questionnaires that talk about that ask parents about their child's behavior, as well as ask about parental monitoring. Again, sorry, there's another slide missing here, but it's just introducing the screen time questionnaires. So that's sort of the bulk of the questionnaires that we have in the Novel Technologies group. There's self-report for the youth as well as parental report. I'm not gonna go through all the questions. Everything that's highlighted just indicates changes. So I mentioned that ABCD is a longitudinal study, so obviously you don't change measures year to year because it makes it hard to look at changes in behaviors over the course of the 10 years. But we know that the technology landscape changes very quickly, so updates do need to be made, and also these things become inappropriate based on developmental stage, so changes are made based on developmental stage of the youth as they age as well. So we ask a number of questions around weekday and weekend mobile and digital technology use, smartphone use, total device use, again, smartphone use. We ask questions to try to get at addiction. So here's a questionnaire that was developed around sort of smartphone, quote unquote, addiction. A number of social media questions. Another scale that was adapted from the Bergen Facebook addiction scale to get at, quote unquote, sort of general social media addiction. We want to know how sleep is affected by mobile and digital technology use. Again, changes to the questionnaires based on developmental stage, but also based on like changes in the apps that kids are using over time. Video gaming addiction, similar to the social media addiction scale. Of course, online dating, not so relevant for a 9-year-old, maybe a little bit more relevant for a 17-year-old, so we see new things coming in as kids age. And then parent questionnaires as well, around social media use, smartphone use, general internet use, general screen media activity as well. And that slide said thank you, but it's now blank.
So I'm going to be speaking next. I'm not sure if my slides are pulled up next or if Cliff's slides are pulled up next. I'll be continuing with respect to, I'm just going to go through your slides quickly and then maybe rewind at the end. But I'll be picking up where Kara left off with respect to what was that? Okay, I'll be picking up as to where Kara left off with respect to the ABCD study. And I'll be talking about some of our preliminary work looking at the ABCD data with respect to screen media activity, with the hope longitudinally of looking at some of the more refined measures into the types and patterns of screen media activity, which are really important to understand with respect to youth development and the relationships to health and functioning measures. So I'll briefly go through what you will see shortly, which is my title slide, then my disclosures, and then I'm going to jump into ABCD. And it looks like we have my slides at least on screen here. Hopefully they'll be coming up here in a second. And talking about some of the initial work that was done in ABCD from Martin Paulus and colleagues with respect to looking at some of the screen media activity. Okay, we're on my slides. So this is the disclosure slide that I promised. This is now some of the work that Martin Paulus and colleagues looked at in the initial partial first wave release, where they did a principal component analysis looking at high-frequency screen media activity, found that when they did this principal component analysis, the data accounted for 37% of the variance, and it was this one factor that accounted for about 2% of the variance, where high screen media activity in 9 to 10-year-old children was linked to cortical thinning, which may reflect more rapid maturation, and was linked to psychopathology and cognitive performance. This is our ABCD screen media activity research team. We were initially pulled together and supported through a grant from the Children in Screens organization, which we were then able to leverage into NIH R01 level funding. So one of the areas of interest for us is to think about initiation of engagement in potentially addictive behaviors, because data from the substance use field shows that the longer you delay initiation, the less severe problems that people encounter. So we were interested in alcohol consumption. We looked at two data sets, the Human Connectome Project data set and the Nathan Klein Institute sample. And we used an approach called Joint and Independent Variance Explained, which is a way of using the data to look at the ways in which brain structure measures co-vary with one another. We are moving independently of this screen and that screen. So I'm going to see, yes, so now we're back on the same page up here. So using this approach, we found that this joint component accounted for 30 to 40% of the data in the Human Connectome Project data. The brain regions that were identified included a number of cortical and subcortical brain regions with particularly large loading from the brainstem. This model was the regions that we put in, which included over 200 measures, was based on a mouse model of binge drinking behavior. We found that in the Human Connectome Project data, this joint component was linked to early initiation of alcohol use prior to age of 21, and it replicated in the Nathan Klein Institute Rockland sample to a high degree. So what does this have to do with screen media activity? We then looked at using this same approach within the ABCD data and the baseline data, and what we found was that a very similar pattern was observed in the youth in the initial wave of ABCD. So 9 to 10-year-old children, we looked at screen media activity as non-academic screen media activity involving playing video games, texting, etc., and used a quantity frequency measure. We found a joint component that explained, again, over 30% of the variance. It was highly similar to what we found in the Human Connectome Project data. The R was between 0.98 and 0.99. And was linked to externalizing behaviors and high-frequency screen media activity in youth, suggesting that some of the brain factors that may link to early initiation of alcohol use also link to high-frequency screen media activity and externalizing concerns in 9 to 10-year-old children. We have subsequently looked at how this brain structural covariation pattern changes between ages 9 to 10 and ages 11 to 12, and changes in this brain structural covariation pattern mediated the relationship between high-frequency screen media activity in the 9 to 10-year-old children and internalizing concerns 2 years later in the children. So it suggests a brain mechanism by which high-frequency screen media activity may relate longitudinally to internalizing concerns relating to anxiety and depression in these children in late childhood. We've also used, looked at the ABC data in conjunction with the Human Connectome Project development data. In this study that was published in the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, we used the ABCD baseline sample, again 11 to 12,000 children ages 9 to 10, and the Human Connectome Project development data, 600 to 700 individuals aged 5 to 21 years. And we used the machine learning-based approach to identify, looking at screen media activity. What we found was a two-factor solution where a little over a quarter of the children in ABCD baseline data factored into a high-frequency, video-centric screen media activity group, and the majority into a low-frequency group. And that is demonstrated here. That reddish bar is the high-frequency group, and the blue bar, the low-frequency group. And we can see it's mainly for video type of engagement in screen media activity that distinguish the two groups. Now, if we look at how this relates to health and functioning, we found that this high-frequency screen media activity group had higher measures of impulsivity, behavioral activation, and behavioral inhibition, lower measures of crystallized and fluid intelligence, poor performance on verbal memory tests, so lower levels of functioning within a 9 to 10-year-old cohort. But also higher measures of psychopathology measures, including those related to ADHD, externalizing behaviors, internalizing behaviors, prodromal psychotic-like symptoms, were all more frequently found in the high-frequency screen media activity group. Now, when we looked at how this related to the Human Connectome Project data to see if it replicated there, we needed to divide the cohort into the group that was 12 years or younger and 13 years or older in the Human Connectome Project data because this greenish bar, which reflects the older cohort, there seemed to be a difference going from ages 12 to 13, where the 13 and above year group showed a more socio-communication-centric pattern of high-frequency screen media activity. So it suggests that, not surprisingly, as youth go from childhood to adolescence, there's a shift in terms of screen media activity patterns, and it will be important for us to look within the ABCD cohort to see whether these youth that are identified here in the HCPD data are a different cohort of individuals and what may mediate transitions. So this, I think, has important implications for example, gender-related or sex-related differences, as we heard about earlier with these are data from meta-analysis that show that females as compared to males are more likely to have problems with social media addiction and males as compared to females with gaming problems. I also thought I would mention that we've been involved in some international efforts, including a cooperation in science and technology cost initiative that focused on problematic usage of the internet. And there is an e-booklet that can be downloaded for free at www.internetandme.eu that is meant to be a practical resource for a number of stakeholders. Also have been involved with the World Health Organization in various meetings over the past decade. This in part was leading up to the 11th revision of the International Classification of Diseases, or the ICD-11, where gaming disorder has been introduced as an official diagnosis, and happy to talk more about that. We're now working on developing internationally suitable screening and diagnostic instruments. Also internationally, we have an international society for the study of behavioral addictions, where a lot of work, particularly with respect to problematic usage of the internet, is discussed. Last conference was in Korea. Next conference is in Gibraltar in early July of 2024. So I'd like to thank everyone for their attention, thank collaborators and funding organizations, including Children's Screens and NIH.
Now they're going to pull up my slides, so hang on just a minute. While we're waiting, thank you to my colleagues for your great presentation. And I really want you guys to be able to leave the conference with, I'll introduce myself while they're getting my slides. I'm Cliff Sussman. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I have a private practice here in DC, and I specialize in treating screen addictions and problematic use of the internet and all sorts of excessive screen time problems. I've been doing that since before the pandemic. So I want you guys to leave here, like I was saying, with a good, just some real practical, useful clinical approaches to actually treating the people who present with this. So that's why I'm going to skip over a lot of what I'd usually talk about when it comes to assessing and, the symptoms and criteria. Fortunately, my colleagues touched on it. You can go to WHO to find out the criteria for gaming disorder, for example. And I'm going to show you some more resources at the end of my talk if you want to get more background on that or learn about more treatments. I'm just going to give you a sliver of the treatment approaches. But the research on treatment itself is ongoing, but it's still very limited. There's lots of problems comparing studies. We all know the thing is the demand is there, right? The demand for treatment is there. These kids are not doing well. They're having lots of problems from their excessive screen use, and they're coming and asking for help. So we have to address that because it really deeply affects their lives. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the theoretical basis for my approaches. My approaches a lot of them are based on the approaches we use for treating substance use disorders. And, my colleagues backed that up a little bit, why we would do that. And I'm also going to talk about, I was pressing the wrong one. So I'm going to talk about that relationship. And I'm also going to talk about the different types of modalities that I use in my clinical practice. Just like I said, a sliver of them, maybe the ones that are more supported by the evidence. And let me start, like I was saying, by going into a little bit of why I use an addiction approach. And we can talk about the scientific understanding that we have of why screens are so hard for our kids to stop using. We know about the dopamine pathways in the brain. We know that they're activated more by how fast you get what you want than what you're actually getting. And we also know that digital devices, I like to refer to them as virtual shortcut machines, because they're really designed to give us what we get in the real world, but right away, right? Not necessarily a better version of it. It's not about quality, it's about speed. And so you really get a lot of dopamine flow from these digital devices as opposed to all these other activities these kids are doing. And you can see that, the green arrow points in the direction of dopamine flow. We know from other talks you've heard about how the prefrontal cortex is underdeveloped in the kids this age. So you have a lot of driver without a lot of brakes. And so what's going to happen? You're going to keep going. And so what happens is when these kids will binge for days and all night long, and they'll miss class, they won't do their work, and then when they finally get off, they'll have all these residual problems, such as irritability and aggression towards parents and extreme boredom, and they'll do anything they can to get back on a screen. You see all these aggressive seeking behaviors. And in the literature, that state's been called like reward deficiency syndrome. Theoretically, one of the causes is that you get desensitized to all this dopamine flow, that you get this postsynaptic receptor downregulation. And so that's how these kids are presenting. And then, let's see. Oh, good. Okay, it's working up there, but not here. Got it. So you have these kids, they present with a binging problem, right? And for my treatment approach, I'm not trying to get these kids off of screens completely, because that's just not realistic. It's impossible this day and age, especially with this digital world in the wake of the pandemic. But rather, I'm trying to help with this binging problem, right? I'm really trying to get a balance. And parents will like balance, but parents often focus on productivity. They'll say to their kids often, you finish your homework, you can have your screen time, right? But that's not really how the reward system works. So I focus more on getting a balance between what I define as high dopamine activities and low dopamine activities. And it's more of a continuum than a binary thing, granted, but I define high dopamine activities as activities that are like instantly and continuously stimulating, like TikTok or video games. And low dopamine activity is activities that need more patience. They have more of a delay in gratification, things like doing homework, doing exercise, but also puzzles, board games, playing a musical instrument, all sorts of low dopamine activities for our kids if they want them. And the goal of treatment is to help patients balance the two. And so to do that for a lot of my clients who come in with really severe problems, I sometimes have to take them through 3 phases, and they gradually go through these phases. They may go back and forth. But the first phase for a lot of kids has to be some kind of dopamine detoxification, just a temporary one. Although you'll see residential centers just do this like for 45 days. They'll just continually, they'll just never get access to screens the whole time they're there. And then if they go back into the old environment, that may not do that much. But I found from a lot of clinical experience and from doing this with families for a long time on an outpatient basis that you would be amazed how much change you can see from just 3 days of a dopamine detoxification, that it's enough to have parents call me and say, I have my old kid back. What's going on? They're not seeking anymore. So sometimes that's all it takes, and then they're ready for the next phase, which, because they still can't really regulate themselves, even if they're not seeking as hard, that's when we want balance, but we need some external help, some external regulation. And on an outpatient basis, that often looks like family parenting interventions. And so I'll do a lot of work with parents and families. I'll show you what that looks like next. And the eventual goal for these kids is balance through self-regulation so that they can successfully launch. So let me talk about some of those family interventions for that second phase. I work with parents a lot on giving kids as much structured low dopamine activities as possible. lots of planned activities, joining leagues or clubs or groups. Having a schedule is really important. You'd be surprised how many families don't have an activity schedule for their kids. But for all that unstructured time the kids have, like during those long lockdowns of the pandemic, for example, I like for parents to have, if they can, alternating blocks of low dopamine and high dopamine activities, which may mean that for a younger kid, it's shorter, the high dopamine block, than for an older kid. Maybe for a kid, it's like 30 minutes, a standard length of time. And for an older kid, maybe it's an hour. And what you do is, if you make the low dopamine block following the high dopamine block at least that long. So if you had a half an hour of high dopamine, you get a half an hour of low dopamine. And then what happens is, not only are you giving kids less, binging, but what you're also doing is you're actually training skills, because every time they have to get off, they're having to use those breaks, and every time they have to wait to get on, they're having to delay their gratification. So maybe in theory, you're actually building up those breaks, that prefrontal cortex. You're training it. And I also work with parents on staying away from these sort of contracts where the kids sign it and they immediately break it and all is lost. I really like to have, rules for that are actually designed to be broken, but that's okay, because the parents have logical and immediate consequences already in place for when they're broken, which means that it may look like, if you go over by 5 minutes on a high dopamine activity because you're in the middle of a group activity with your friends and in the middle of a mission, you already know ahead of time that that's going to be multiplied by 3, let's say. So you get 15 minutes then taken away from your next high dopamine block. So we'll have very straightforward interventions like that. And it's really more about how well the parents enforce it and how consistent they are than anything else. Similarly, you can have positive reinforcement for following the rules. If a kid times themselves using a timer and they get off, they self-regulate, they get off when their timer goes off, they transition themselves, maybe they get like a stamp on a card, like you get at Subway or Starbucks. Maybe you get 5 stamps, you get to turn it in for ice cream or a pizza party. You just don't want to reward with like extra screen time, because then you get away from that balance we're talking about. So logical and immediate consequences. Like a lot of parents will say to kids, if your GPA is this, you get for a certain amount of time, you get an iPad, and if it goes under that, you lose the iPad. But to me, that's not like a really clear logical connection. Plus, it's about delayed gratification, which we know is not how our kids' brains work. So I stay away from that. And a lot of the work I do with parents and families, probably the most work, is on managing environmental cues. In fact, I actually try to get parents to have like a high dopamine zone and a low dopamine zone in their house. Because if you go into a room filled with screens and devices and you try to sit down and do homework on one of them, that homework's probably not getting done, because you've got all these cues that are calling the brain to do other things. And so at the same time, if you have a room that has all the devices in it and they stay there and charge there, a lot of parents will have a much easier time getting a kid to leave that room at the end of a high dopamine block than they will prying a device out of their hands. So, setting up the cues in the environment is so important in addiction. You wouldn't have an alcoholic drink water in a bar. So I do a lot of work with that. Now, as far as my individual work with my patients, and I do a lot of one-on-one individual therapy, weekly therapy with teenagers. I use a lot of motivational interviewing. It comes in very handy because these kids are teens, so they're naturally ambivalent, but everybody with addiction-related problems has a lot of ambivalence. There's a part of them that wants to change and a part of them that doesn't. And so what I really like about motivational interviewing is that it's an insight-oriented approach. It allows patients to become their own authority figures rather than just having me become another one for them to defy. And and so I try not to become just an extension of parental control. They have parents for that, and I'm working with the parents separately. Rather, I'll use neutrality, I'll use open-ended questions, reflective listening. Get kids to really explore their own ambivalence and tell me what the problems are from their screen use rather than me telling them. And then, the area of treatment that you'll probably see the most evidence-based literature on is CBT, so I'm going to, talk a little bit about that one in particular, which I do use a lot of in my practice. Cognitive behavioral therapy is, a really great way to identify with kids the types of thoughts and feelings that are contributing to their screen use behaviors. And I also will find when I do this work with them that a lot of the standard cognitive distortions come up, but there's also cognitive distortions that are specific to screen use problems, like time distortion, which is where you lose sense of real world time because you're on your games, and also things like fear of missing out that's been talked about a lot with kids needing a cell phone. There's biological treatments as well. I'm not going to focus a lot on this today because there isn't the most research on this, but there's some evidence that bupropion and atomoxetine, bupropion being an antidepressant, atomoxetine being a non-stimulant ADHD drug, there's some evidence that they can be helpful, but not as a treatment by itself, but as a supplement to the psychotherapy and the other work you're doing. Methylphenidate is a stimulant which can also help, but just you got to be careful with that because there's the risk that it's only going to help while you're on it and you're going to crash afterwards and have a rebound effect. So you can't be on that around the clock like late at night when you're gaming all night. Let me just wrap up by saying that these kids aren't presenting to me, of course, with just screen addiction or problematic internet use. Of course, they're presenting to me with all sorts of other issues going on, like, they'll have ADHD, they'll have autism, anxiety, depression. Of course, I manage those things. Of course, I treat those things as well. But the problem that I see is that with a lot of other clinicians who might have seen them before me, they'll do what we've been discouraging them from doing in some of these other talks. They'll make the causal connection, and they'll say, you treat the ADHD, you treat the anxiety, even though the cause probably goes both ways, but you treat that and then the screen problems will go away and lo and behold it fails, so they come to see me. And that's when I address the elephant in the room, and that's what I want to encourage all of you guys to do. Talk to these kids about their screen use, find out what their problems are with screen use, and you may find that if you actually address the screen use issues early on in treatment, that you now get access to treating all these other issues. So let me just wrap up by saying that if you want more information on this or on the stuff I skipped over for time, I'm not plugging my services. I just want to show you that on my website there is a info tab that has a ton of free videos you can download. You can also go to the WHO website for gaming disorder criteria. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for some questions, so if people would like to step up to the microphones, introduce themselves, and then ask the question, that would be greatly appreciated.
Hi, my name is Mary Bruce. I'm from Telethon Kids Institute in Australia. Thank you very much for that really insightful presentation. My research takes more of a public health lens, and so we're kind of focused more on early intervention. And so I had a question around the clinical support that you provide, and really around how early are you seeing children come to you presenting with these issues, so that we can kind of take that away and know how early we should be reaching out to parents, talking to them about these things, so that ideally we can avoid getting to that point of addiction. And I guess on top of that, do you approach dealing with younger kids, if you do, any differently than what you presented here?
Yeah, no, those are great questions, and let me just, the general answer is like the earlier the better. I've seen cases where kids are compulsively watching videos of people open chocolate eggs on YouTube when they're like, 2, 3 years old. I've seen parents feed infants using screens. I mean, I don't just see patients, I also do a lot of talks in the community to lots of parents, and so parents of younger kids as well, so I try to give them a lot of education, because I definitely think the earlier you can intervene, the better. And but I would say in my practice, since I started, like before the pandemic, it was a lot of college dropouts, and then after the pandemic, you had a lot of younger kids from the lockdowns who picked it up, and the age range just keeps growing and growing, older and younger on both sides, and you do have to have different interventions. Like in some of my longer talks, I'll talk about transitioning, using balanced parenting to transition kids from the younger kids needing more limit setting to the older kids being more self-regulating, and I'm happy to talk to you more about it later. So.
Sorry, I also just wanted to make a note. So I think a lot of this work, so I'm also a child psychiatrist, actually should fall on pediatricians and educators, right? Because they see these kids a lot younger than we do as child psychiatrists. By the time they get to us, it's kind of like too late. So I do a lot of work with pediatric groups and training pediatricians to do this work in their clinics for the annual visits, because they see these kids every year. They see the parents every year. And so really working with the parents from birth on around healthy screen habits is really important. Same in elementary schools as well.
Great, thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.
Hi. For Dr. Potenza, am I saying it right?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm a non-scientist. I'm an advocate and policy person. I'm Tamara Sobel from Media Literacy Now. I just wanted to go back to things you said, scientific terms that I wanted a little lay translation on. Cortical thinning. Just tell us in maybe more lay terms what that means and why it's important.
Yes, so cortical thinning is, throughout development, there are changes in brain structure that occur that relate to changes in brain function. So part of the processes involve, for example, making connections between different nerve cells that occur as individuals develop. And there are stages of time where more connections are made during the infancy through childhood period, and times where connections are pruned back. So the connections that are used more frequently get maintained and sustained, whereas those that are not used get truncated. And in this process, due to other developmental changes, there are periods of time where the ratios of brain sizes change. And the cortex, in some periods of development, becomes more compact or thins, and that going from childhood to adolescence may reflect a more rapid maturation process.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Kylie Woodman. I work in the Media Neuroscience Lab at UCSB. I also previously worked on the ABCD study on the Novel Technologies group for a year. So I have a few questions. Well, first of all, also thank y'all so much for your pivotal work in getting internet gaming disorder a diagnosable disorder. I feel like that can really advance the scientific research. I guess two questions. First one is, I wanted to get your thoughts on the gender differences that occur between behavioral addictions. As you showed, social media addiction is a little bit more prevalent for girls, whereas video game addiction is a little bit more prevalent for boys. I've also done some light reading that this may also be a little different in how symptoms are exhibited. So I would be curious, just some general thoughts. And if we have time, I'll ask the second question. Thank you.
Did you? Oh, you, okay.
Either way.
Well, I mean, I do, in my office, I see lots of teenagers, both boys and girls, and I see I do see some girls with gaming addiction, and I do see some boys with social media addiction, but so overall, I think it holds up with the way people are presenting that I am seeing a lot of social media addicted girls and gaming addicted boys, but I think there's a lot of overlap. And one of the reasons for that, aside from just all the different presentations of people you'll see, is that there's so much that gaming has become so much like social media, and social media has become so much like gaming. With people, the way people game now, it's mostly online multiplayer gaming. All these gamers are using Discord to communicate with each other, which is like social media for gamers. And so, and then because you'll hop from one source of dopamine to another, often what you see is that when the parents get the boy, let's say, off the video game, they go and take out a cell phone and do social media, or maybe they're just going to watch people do a let's play of the game they were just playing. So.
Yeah, so I'll also comment on that picking up on several points, one being this blurred boundaries between different types of internet use is, I think, pervasive across a variety of behaviors. So not only gaming and social media use, but also pornography use, shopping and buying, and other behaviors on the internet. So one of the publications that we had a few years back was that when the Fortnite server crashed, the Pornhub reported that the percentage of gamers increased by 10% and searches for Fortnite-related pornography increased by 60%. So it suggests that there's these complex relationships that we're only beginning to understand. With respect to sex differences, the proportion of girls and females engaging in video gaming has been increasing, and problems have been increasing among girls and women, but still tends to be predominantly male.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your responses, and I hope to talk to you all maybe a little bit more about content differences and conditioning of dopamine pathways. But yes, thank you so much for your response.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Lauren Pear from Fair Play's Screen Time Action Network, and I apologize to say that I only caught the last presentation by Dr. Sussman, so if either of the other two of you have comments, please, I'd like to hear them too. Dr. Sussman, you were talking about motivational interviewing that you do with young people, and I was just kind of curious what you're hearing back from them for what they see as problematic behavior and what their motivations are, and if potentially you could share a couple of questions that we might be able to ask young people struggling ourselves, not in a clinical setting, but just as seems like a good mode, curious.
Yeah, so like one of the things I really emphasize that we hone in on in assessing with kids is not just the amount of hours they're on, but what's happening when they get off. So with motivational interviewing, I'll often have, my teens telling me that they really can notice that they're different people when they've been binging forever afterwards, that they'll be tired, they'll be, the next day in class, they won't be able to focus as well, even after, even though they're not on games at the time, although some people will use games in class too. You find out a lot more about kids' screen habits when you have a rapport with them and when they trust you than you might find out from their parents. So like the parents are only like figuring out the tip of the iceberg. Although generally speaking, I will say that kids are worse at covering their tracks, but then they are at like getting there. So they're very good at like sneaking around the parents and accessing what they need to access, and hacking through parental control software, and so they're very good. It's very hard to stop someone from getting to their drug, but the parents do catch on eventually. And so sometimes I'll even talk to patients about like whether they actually wanted to get caught, So anyway, I could answer your question for hours, but we can talk later if you want. But.
And I think we could talk for hours. However, I've also gotten notification from our timekeeper that we have run out of time for the session, but I and I believe the other presenters as well would be happy to talk outside of this session and answer any questions. And I think as moderator, I've also been asked when the slide comes up on screen to encourage people to provide feedback on this session and during the conference itself, because people's input is really valuable for how the conference is organized and developed, and we really do take into account people's thoughts about what worked, what didn't work, and topics that could be covered in greater depth in the future. So thank you all for your attention and involvement, and have a great conference.